Facepalm America. Beowulf Rockland here. FacepalmAmerica.com is where you can go to get more information on the program. Connect with us on social media. Listen to past episodes, and I urge you to do that. And if you would like to connect with us anytime to leave your comments, either verbally, directly with me on the show if you'd like, or via message, you can do that at 202-656-6271. Populism in this day and age, in 2023, and certainly since 2026, has understandably acquired kind of a bad reputation. Populism has been connected with Donald Trump and the Make America Great Again movement. On the other side, it's also been connected with Bernie Sanders and the Democratic Socialist movement in America, which has flourished since 2014 or so. And it's meant various things over the course of the history of the United States politically. But in a different time, it certainly did not have the pejorative cast to it that it has largely acquired today. In fact, it was definitely very much about the little guy and protecting him or herself against the big and powerful interests. In fact, there was a populist movement, the People's Party in the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s that gained quite a bit of popularity and acquired a few offices across the United States of America. And yet we have kind of forgotten about that in 2023. And I think it is worthwhile to remember that such a thing is possible when people bind together for common cause against powers that exceed their own. So we're going to speak about this today with Steve Babson. He is the author of Forgotten Populists: When Farmers Turned Left to Save Democracy. Steve, welcome to Facepalm America. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
So tell us who these early populists were. Like how did they come into being, and what forces were they trying to combat?
Well, the original populists were calling for change in the 1890s when farmers and railroad workers and coal miners and a wide range of reformers launched a new movement that would change the political terrain of the country in ways that we're still living with. Its official name was the People's Party, right. But they called themselves populists as a kind of shorthand. And they were angry about the way in which both the Democrats and the Republicans at that time, both uniformly conservative, and both of them favoring a rising class of corporate robber barons, as they were called, who'd come to power after the Civil War. And they were those robber barons were using violence and bribery and monopoly power to crush opponents of big business, which was unprecedented at that moment in American history. So farmers who at that time, by the way, and I guess I should remind your listeners that this is a different farm economy that we're talking about. Back in 1890, more than 40% of all people gainfully employed and working were farmers or farm laborers. And today that percentage is down to under 2%. So they're still progressive farmers, but a lot of them now are contractors working for Tyson and major corporate interests.
Right. And back then it was not big agribusiness. This was primarily individual and family farmers tilling the soil themselves and selling what they could. And, they didn't have the structures, corporate or otherwise, that exist today.
Right. Now, they wanted, to participate in the new industrial economy that was largely driven by the extraordinary growth in railroading, thousands and thousands of miles of track laid. And at first, the railroads were welcomed as a way for farmers to get their crops to market in an affordable and sustainable way. But they soon learned that the railroad corporations were much more interested in maximizing the bottom line, and doing so really in a way that defrauded customers, really investors as well, who were widely cheated by the investors of that day. railroad companies that were usually in bankruptcy, that were poorly managed, and very dangerous to work for. In 1891, 2,600 railroad workers were killed in avoidable accidents on the nation's railroads. So what farmers wanted to do was address a circumstance where, for example, in Kansas, during the severe depression of 1893, 1894, unemployment's over 20%. Farmers are struggling to pay off the fixed costs of their debt. And to ship corn from Kansas to Chicago, it actually cost more, given the inflated freight rates that the railroads were charging. It cost more to ship that corn to market than that corn would fetch in the Windy City once it went on the marketplace. So farmers are in extraordinarily dire circumstances, and workers as well, by the way. Wages are being cut by 30%. Railroad workers went on strike in 1894 on the American Railway Union in the famous Pullman strike, which was broken when the federal government, again, acting on behalf of the robber barons, sent in federal troops. And after that, it was a wholesale, hunting season, and well over 30 people were killed in Chicago alone in the suppression of that strike. So populists were reacting to that kind of circumstance where both the Republicans and the Democrats were devoted to maximizing the profitability of this new class of robber barons, corporate executives who were leading these huge corporate empires.
So when I bring up the idea, or when I hear someone bring up the idea of forming a third party in the year 2023, or even voting for a third party in the year 2023, I am told constantly, well, you're just wasting your vote. You're actually just going to hurt the other parties, and you need to fall in line and vote for one of the other major existing parties. And while I realize that the political landscape and the media landscape have changed considerably since the 1890s, I imagine they were probably hearing some of the same things themselves, weren't they?
They were, but they were also in a very different set of circumstances. At that time, both political parties were basically closed shops. There was no internal mechanism for giving voice to potential alternative ways of defining party politics.
This was largely before the era of primaries, wasn't it?
That's what I'm saying. Yeah,
right.
There was no presidential primary. So party bosses could pretty much run the conventions as a show to maximize their own internal power and to marginalize anybody who was advocating for a reform or a different approach. Obviously, that's not the case today. And what's more important, I think, is that the populists, as a third party, they had to organize as a third party. They had no alternative, really, within the party as they saw it. But their very success in the early 1890s, they elected 50 members of Congress in the early 1890s. They elected 6 governors. They elected mayors and county executives across the country, but particularly in the Great Plains and in the South. That was where their strongholds were. And as a result, the Democratic Party in particular actually started to adopt and co-opt, in a way, part of the populist program. They began to adopt some of the reform agenda that the populists had been advocating. And in fact, even in the Republican Party, there were reformers who, and this sounds sort of counterintuitive, but in that era, there was emerging out of the Republican Party something called progressive Republicans. I know that sounds like an impossible matter these days, but back then, what the populists set off was they broke this logjam and they opened up, particularly the Democratic Party, which over the ensuing decades, really culminating in the New Deal of the 1930s, adopted much of what the populists had been about. Some of it was transformed and altered, but a lot of it was the sort of things that the Populist Party had been recommending and things we take for granted now. I mean, the populists across state populist parties were advocating votes for women. Right. This is a time when the Constitution barred women from voting in elections. The populists said, that's absurd. They're half of our world, and their vital contribution has to be recognized in voting rights. They also, in the South, argued for the common economic issues that should unify black and white farmers. and they wanted a multiracial movement in the South. And for a time, they really threatened the status quo in the South, so much so that the white supremacists reacted with a violent campaign, assassinating populists,
Wow.
terrorizing their opposition, and enforcing what then came to be called Jim Crow, which was in place for the roughly half a century thereafter. That was in reaction to populism and the threat that that multiracial movement represented to the ruling elite in the South.
So the populist movement really was a precursor to the progressive movement of the 20th century. I'm wondering, because like so many progressive movements over the course of the last 100 years have been labeled by conservative and reactionary forces as communists. Was that label applied, or some version of it, to the Populist Party?
Yeah, not with much success. I mean, the Populist Party was clearly a homegrown phenomenon. It emerged out of the Great Plains in the South. It was based on the Farmers Alliance and their work together with, in a big tent. Populism was a pretty big tent, along with the Knights of Labor, the coal miners, railroad workers, and so on. Nevertheless, conservatives said, well, no, they're secret anarchists. They're planning a bloodbath on the same scale as the Paris Commune.
Right.
And in fact, what the populists did advocate for was cooperatives on the one hand. Basically, that farmers should form their own union, in effect. They should come together and sell their product collectively, because that would give them more bargaining power in the market. But they weren't about abolishing markets. They wanted to enhance their ability to negotiate with grain merchants and the railroads to get better freight rates and get better prices in the market. And they also said that if the railroads were not going to reform their practices and stop killing railroad workers and stop gouging customers, that the railroad should actually be made public property and run for the public benefit. And they argued that this isn't socialism. This is just collecting and retrieving the public resources that were gifted to the railroads to encourage their construction in the decades after the Civil War. Just one little detail. In order to encourage railroad construction at a time when the public certainly favored it, the railroads were actually gifted 170 million acres of free land out of the Federal Reserve. That's the equivalent to the size of Texas.
Wow.
They were given lower taxes. They were given assistance in paying off their debt. They were paid subsidies, direct cash subsidies for each mile of railroad laid. And so the populace said, look, they were built with public resources, and they're now being abused on behalf of private profiteering. We should take these back and operate them for the public benefit, for the benefit of small farmers and retailers and wholesalers who need affordable transportation and freight.
It's fascinating to me, because the cooperatives that you referred to, many of them exist to this day in the United States of America. They have not been dismantled by a century or more of reactionary politics yet.
Yeah, and there's a whole range of cooperatives. Some of them have gotten rather large and have indeed been allied with corporate interests, but some of them, many of them, are still small enough so that individual participants in that cooperative enterprise can feel like their voice makes a difference. And it can mean a cooperative selling of the combined product of many dairy farmers, for example, or it can mean combined efforts to get lower prices on insurance, to get electrical service, because during the 1930s, the major corporate utilities did not want to build electrical power in rural America. It wasn't profitable enough. So the New Deal had to initiate a process in which they encouraged and supported cooperative electrical companies in rural America. That's how rural America was electrified, was through cooperatives. And so what the Knights of Labor and the populists were about, the Farmers Alliance, was trying to make an economy in which people would participate in a market economy, but they would do so collectively as the combined power of farmers and workers controlling their own destiny.